The following podcast may be disturbing to those who support hatred, terrorism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting installment here of How We Fought Against podcast. My name is Arsen Ostrovsky. We are here with the International Legal Forum, and we are speaking today with Günther Jikeli. I hope I got that right, Günther.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you for the invitation.
It's our pleasure, Günther. It's really exciting to have you here. For those who don't know Günther, he is the Rosenfeld Professor at Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. He is an Associate Professor also in Germanic Studies and Jewish Studies at the Indiana University. He is an expert on anti-Semitism, all manifestations and forms of it. He has written widely on the topic as well, very much considered an expert. In 2013, Günther was awarded the prestigious Raoul Wallenberg Prize in Human Rights and Holocaust Studies. We have a lot to speak about today. We will be talking about the status of anti-Semitism, the IHRA Holocaust Remembrance Lines definition, which is a very hot topic at the moment. And of course, we will also talk about the situation in Germany, where Günther is originally from, both with respect to the status of anti-Semitism. What is the situation? We look at perhaps the moral culture at the moment, some of the challenges, perhaps some of where the opportunities lie as well, and maybe some of the steps that are being taken. And we will discuss, of course, some of Günther's research as well. Günther, thank you so much again for being on this podcast. It's really a pleasure and honor having you here. So welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. Günther, I wanted to sort of to start off with a discussion perhaps about the whole IRA, the definition, a working definition of anti-Semitism. For those who don't know, this is, of course, in reference to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance of definition. It's probably the most widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism today, been adopted by some 30 plus countries, a host of multilateral institutions and organizations and civil society. But it is also very much a hot topic at the moment. And I'm saying that because even though it is very much so widely endorsed, we have also seen in recent weeks the sort of spate of alternate definitions that have come from different political elements, trying to perhaps water down this definition. I'd love to hear your perspective. I know you're very much a supporter of the IRA definition. You signed an important petition, which has just been released with over 350 academics and scholars from around the world offering their support behind the IRA definition. So I'd love to hear from you, perhaps, one, why the IRA definition is so important in the fight against anti-Semitism, and perhaps your perspective on some of the alternate definitions that have popped up, and where are they coming from, and how does this fit into the broader debate?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the IRA definition, it has a long history, going back at least to 2004. That came up when in Europe there was a rise of anti-Semitic incidents, and many of these incidents came in the disguise of hatred against Israel, Israelis, or Zionism, and Jews were under attack on the streets of France, Germany, Belgium, United Kingdom, and often then perpetrators would be attacking Jews and saying something of hatred against Israel. So that made people realize, well, sometimes anti-Semitism comes in the disguise of some hatred against Israel or anti-Zionism. And then Jewish communities came together in cooperation with authorities of the European Union and said, look, we need a definition to give it to policemen and women to recognize what is anti-Semitic, what's not anti-Semitic, so that we can deal with that. And that's what they did. So it's a definition that was really, a lot of work was put in there in close cooperation with Jewish organizations. So I see it as a document now that gives pause, if you want, to say, well, we have to acknowledge groups that are directly targeted. What is their definition? How do they see anti-Semitism when it comes up? And that is from these experiences. So of course, this is not a philosophical definition that explains what anti-Semitism is, but it's a working definition in the sense of you can work with that to recognize when anti-Semitism might be involved if something comes up. So that is also why then this definition has a lot of examples. So it has a really very broad definition in a sentence saying that anti-Semitism can come up in many ways, but then gives concrete examples of how that might be voiced. And it explicitly says, well, you always have to look at the context, and not criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. So it is a very careful definition, but it says, well, there are some examples how anti-Semitism can be verbalized or shown in a way that in the beginning you would think maybe this is only about Israel, but in fact it's not about Israel. So if Israel is demonized obsessively in a way that no other country is, if the Jewish people right to self-determination of a Jewish state that is not only questioned but attacked, then anti-Semitism can be very much involved. And I would say it's very likely that anti-Semitism is involved. So that's what the ARA definition does. So resistance against that is saying, well, we want to ignore this experience of so many Jews who helped to draw this definition based on all the anti-Semitic incidents that happened in Europe in the last 20 years, but also increasingly in the United States now, where this is part of the experience of many Jews. And so this opposition against that, much of it, maybe not all of it, is really saying, well, we don't want to see that. We explicitly want to exonerate our friends, maybe who voice these kind of things, saying, well, this cannot be anti-Semitic by definition. So it turns it on its head. And that's why I think it's important to say, well, we should first take this definition as the first, sign, go through these examples. Maybe certain cases, if somebody says even exactly what is in this example, maybe there is a reason why this is not anti-Semitic, but we should take it seriously at first. So that's, what we do in all other forms of hatred, usually. In racism, we do that. We say, if somebody feels a racist attack, we take that seriously as first. And then we can say, discuss it. Maybe there were also other reasons. It was not because of some racist sentiments that somebody was discriminated against, but we should at first take it seriously. So that is what the ARA definition helps us with in a context in universities, saying, okay, look, if Jewish students get attacked.
I did want to ask you, perhaps, this is something I think also quite important in terms of practically how, and you're obviously you're a professor, you live, breathe, work in the intellectual world, and from my perspective, and I know we spoke about it just before going live on air, that so much of the discussion on anti-Semitism and the narratives that we're having, it emanates from the academic or from the philosophical, intellectual level, as what we're seeing on campus, and then that flows down to other elements of society, but not least of which amongst or to the very students that are on campus. So from your perhaps experience, how would you advise, or what would you tell, say, a student who has experienced anti-Semitism, how they could use IRA on a practical perhaps level?
Right. This is helpful in the way to say, well, you should not ignore this experience. You should take it seriously. And so, because often in the past, before the ARA definition was accepted or known, people would talk it away, as in many cases, would just not acknowledge certain incidents as being anti-Semitic. We have that even, I mean, in Germany, there's this infamous case of a trial in Wuppertal, where a young man went to this local synagogue and put fire in front of the synagogue and attacked the synagogue in that way. And then they claimed that they were doing this only as a kind of criticism of Israel. And so they were not charged with the additional additional hate crime, but only for the firebombing. So that was just ignoring it. And in the context of universities, the same.
By the way, apologies if I'm not mistaken. That in that particular instance, the synagogue in question was actually firebombed during Kristallnacht.
Well, you mean on the anniversary of it?
No, in the original Kristallnacht.
Okay, yeah. Well,
was not firebombed, but sorry, perhaps it was attacked at the time, and it's a very eerie sort of coming back, whereas we're talking in the 30s was of course attacks on Jews, and today we're talking about, and something I think I mentioned before, as Rabbi Sachs spoke about, this mutating virus that first they came for the Jews, for the religion, then the race, and now the nation state, Israel. So it's this incredible sort of, I think in many ways, reversal, whereas what was once attacks on Jews, and now it's an attack on the Jewish state, or Israel as the Jew amongst the nations. You were mentioning before, it's it's something that it's not politically correct anymore, or not as much to to say I'm anti-Semitic, heaven forbid, but it's been sort of mutated or morphed into a more dangerous, perhaps more politically correct, criticism of Zionism or Israel. That's somehow become, fashionable in some circles. Is that perhaps a fair assessment in your perspective today?
Yeah, I mean if you look at that of anti-Semitism as a form of sentiment that is there, that is more than just some stereotypes flowing around. So that means then that people have these kind of feelings inside, and even if they are not allowed, if you want, by polite society to express this openly, these sentiments, or even maybe they don't allow that themselves, saying, I don't want to be an anti-Semite, right? But still having these kind of feelings. So then you look for ways to express it. And everyone has different ways to express it. And if you, let's assume there is an anti-Semite who has these sentiments and doesn't work on these sentiments, but needs to express it, if you talk about it in that way. So then to voice that in a way that is seemingly only attacking Israel is a way that he might get away with that in wider society. So that encourages people to leave it out in that way, if you want. And that's something that has been described already since the 1960s by Jean Amery, for example. So he described that in the case of Germany, but it's not only in Germany we can see that. So in any case, we see that goes to some extent as the incident I just described in Wuppertal, where it's so obvious if Jews or the synagogue in Germany gets attacked, and even people say, oh, I did this because I want to criticize Israel. It doesn't make any sense. It means the person who does that, for this person, the Jews in Israel or in Germany, it's just one. And if they attack it, then it's a kind of criticism of Israel also, and also of Jews in Germany. So that is clearly anti-Semitic. but often it's even more subtle, right? And subtle in a way that that you just obsessively criticizing Israel entirely, saying Israel is entirely a racist country, which if you look into detail, well, of course there is racism in Israel, as in I think every country, unfortunately, but it's not in the essence, if you want, of Israel, or that there would be an apartheid system, and then all the comparisons to Nazi Germany. I mean, this is super strange. Why this obsessive comparisons to Nazi Germany of Israel, of all countries? That also reveals in itself some kind of very tortured thinking, if you want. If you make this, if you now make Israel responsible for something similar as the Nazis did, why that country? And then, of course, it doesn't hold up in any way if you start comparing that. I mean, there are no death camps that Israel is operating. There is no genocide that Israel is orchestrating. There is nothing of that. There are no ghettos that Israel is responsible of. So it just doesn't make any sense if you just look at that for 1 minute. There is no apartheid system in Israel. Anyone who just looks at like only a glimpse at the laws in Israel sees that Israel treats all citizens equally. You have like Arabs in the Knesset, and I mean this is this is I mean very quickly you see that this is nonsense. But why do people do it? Maybe they just don't know, they're ignorant, but it could also be because they want to express their sentiments against Jews in a way where they think they get away with that. And the Arab definition gives a pause there and says, well, maybe we should have a look at that at least. Maybe that's an anti-Semitic motivation behind that, why you're doing that. So of course, those who do that, they don't like it. So I see this resistance against the Arab definition rather as a sign of that is effective, that is really having an impact. Because otherwise I mean, why should people be bothered? So I think it's a good sign, it's a good discussion now that we have to have, and making the point, well, some of these forms are in fact anti-Semitic, and if people don't want to see it, we have to explain it to them, to say, well, you cannot just say everything what people say, if that the word Israel is in there, then it cannot by definition be anti-Semitic. So we have to say, okay, even if you have that in the wording, maybe replacing even the word Jews with Israelis, which I witnessed personally where that happened. Even in Germany, it's been some 17 years back where people were shouting, Juden raus, because an Israeli was coming in to give a talk. And then they were taught to say, Israelis raus, Israelis out. And they just shifted that. So we have to make this argument every time to say, look, the criticism is fine. We need
that's a large part of the, I suppose, debate, or coming from the detractors who are, I mean, they are saying, I think incorrectly so, obviously, as I believe you agree as well, that the Arab definition somehow stifles free speech or criticism of Israel. But I mean, I would think quite on the contrary, because the definition also makes very, very clear that criticism directed against Israel to the same manner that it is directed against any other state is not anti-Semitic. So from my perspective, I'm thinking, what is it about the definition that legitimately opens up Israel to criticism as to every other state, which is fine. But what is it about the definition that really hurts them? I mean, is it the fact that it says comparing Israel to Nazi Germany is anti-Semitic? Do they have a problem with that? Do they have a problem with rejecting the very notion of Zionism, which is the Jewish people's very right to self-determination, or the example of dual loyalty, you know, these very old classical anti-Semitic tropes? So when people say, you know, from my belief that it stifles free speech, I think quite on the contrary, you know, which elements of this definition do you really disagree with? And that's, I think, what we need talk about, but I'd love to hear from your perspective, how do you respond to these accusations that it somehow harms the free discussion or free speech?
Yeah, I spoke to several of the people, the academics who signed the petitions or against this definition, or who came up with new definitions, and I asked them, so what of these examples is so bad that you think you should like go against this definition? And those, at least that I have spoken to, and I find them reasonable, very reasonable people, told me, well, it's not really in the definition, it's not in the examples. We can agree with all these examples. So the argument of those who I think take anti-Semitism seriously, but still don't really want to accept this definition, they argue then saying the definition is used in a way that we don't have free speech. And of course, in theory, this can happen. Of course, you can use anything to suppress free speech if you want. You can, like any moral argument even, saying, well, this and this, we don't, and you can use in the definition as well. This is not what I see happening. So I rather see happening that free speech of pro-Zionist groups are suppressed, or at least people don't want to hear it. I don't see the opposite. And the ARA definition, as you know, is not a legal document. So it can help to identify if this is a hate speech or not. But hate speech is not a hate crime. So you are free to do hate speech legally. And only a few forms of hate speech are then hate crimes. So legally, you can voice anti-Semitic things in most forms in almost all countries, I guess. So that's not a legal thing. But then, of course, that's the question, how is that used? But frankly, I don't see it used in a way that people are suppressed not to say things, but it's used in a way to say, look, this is anti-Semitic, and maybe we should not give you a platform. And also in the case of Germany, often this form of anti-Semitism being voiced in a form of hatred against Israel is more prominent in the arts and in the world of academia than in other parts. So that's a form that, and very often then people who run these institutions, they want to invite people promoting BDS, for example. And they want to promote BDS with public funding. And if some people say, well, look, here's a definition that gives us a hint that what are you doing with your inviting BDS people is in fact promoting anti-Semitic speech. Why do you do this with public funding? Maybe you should not be sponsored by that. So obviously, those who are responsible for these programs, they don't like it. And that's why we see some of these opposition people from these heading these institutions signing up these petitions because they don't want to talk about this. I rather think it's the opposite, that those who oppose so much this definition, they don't want to talk about anti-Semitism. They just want to go on with with inviting like these very often hateful people who promote the destruction of the state of Israel, and they want to do this with taxpayers' money. And they are not happy if people say, and using this IRA definition, saying, look, maybe you should not do this. Maybe this is anti-Semitic. Maybe you should not be allowed to use taxpayers' money for that. So that is, I think, a sign why we can say, well, maybe that's effective. The IRA definition now has at least a little bit of effect to have a discussion about this. So I see that generally as a good thing.
We could talk about IRA all day. In fact, there's entire conferences and seminars dedicated to it, and I really much hope that we can continue this particular discussion. But I would love to perhaps, and as you raised as well, the situation in Germany, discuss a little bit more, perhaps in depth about from that perspective. Obviously, given Germany's unique history. I'd love perhaps if you can give perhaps a rundown of the situation at the moment in terms of anti-Semitism. Some of the figures and reports we're seeing are very alarming, and this is again on the eve, just now on eve of Yom HaShoah, of the Holocaust Remembrance day on the Jewish calendar and here in Israel, and that's a separate discussion as well. But I'd want to know, sort of, if you can give a little bit more perspective about anti-Semitism in Germany, specifically where it's coming from. You mentioned arts and culture. Are we looking at a revival of neo-Nazi movements? Are we looking at a left-wing progressive anti-Semitism, or from some elements of the Muslim community, perhaps? Would love a little more perspective from you in terms of where we're at with the situation in Germany at the moment. So maybe you can give some insight.
Sure. There's a big variety of anti-Semites, if you want. So there's a diversity of anti-Semites. You have that in the mainstream. You have it on the fringes, and you have, I think, three main ideological directions where it's coming from. So you have it still from the populist and far right, who have never accepted German Jews as Germans, who don't want German Jews to be part of Germany, and who don't want to take any responsibility of Germany for the Holocaust, or say that this is really enough of remembrance. We should not remember anymore. We want to draw a line, and this is a popular idea. So it's I think last year there was a survey in Germany in summer 2020 that said 53%, I think, was the number that people said that yes, the National Socialism was a thing of the past and should remain that. Now, that's a popular thing. So we have something like that from the populist right, from the far right. Then we have from
Can I ask, sorry, is that is that limited in your view to the far right, or is it gaining mainstream, I suppose, acceptance within Germany?
Well, 53% is really then already in the mainstream. So in the populist right, so people who like the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, is a populist right movement. So many of them, you can see that also in surveys, that they don't want to any more remembrance of the Holocaust. They even often it borders into conspiracy theories, saying, well, there's a Holocaust industry and we are forced to do that. And even then, a relatively large percentage, 41% in 2019, blamed this in a way against Jews. So saying Jews still talk too much about the Holocaust and what happened to them during that time. So that is not only from the very far right, it's going into mainstream, and many from the AfD, they especially go in that direction. And what you see from the extreme far right, so the neo-Nazi type of people, I mean, they even celebrate still in the way they can neo-Nazism or Nazism. So that is often not so visible, but in some areas where my parents live now, northeast of Germany, So every year there is a Memorial Day for the deaths in Germany, and there is a little memorial where the neo-Nazis gather every year and put flowers and candles to the fallen SS soldiers. And there's a little grave where this SS soldier, and that is every year they put a candle there. And sometimes these neo-Nazis are even a threat to people who voice criticism of this kind of behavior. So earlier this year, my dad, who is a local politician, his house was attacked. There was a little firebomb put on his door and his window, and the window burst because he was criticizing the people in the town parliament who are elected. They have now won from the NPD and their policies. The NPD is the neo-Nazi party, if you want. It's always bordering into being banned, but it's still a party that you can vote for. So you have these kind of incidents sometimes by neo-Nazis, and they can be harmful in some areas, have even like physical power, attack people, especially people who look foreign to them. And of course, they also don't like Jewish communities, but this is often areas where not many or any Jews live. So that's not so visible, the anti-Semitism of these neo-Nazi far-right party, but it's definitely part of it. So you have that. But this is a relatively small minority, this extreme right, but in some cases still like they have some power. Then the populist right, and then you have that goes back to the 60s and even earlier to the 50s of the Soviet anti-Zionist campaigns that were very strong also in Eastern Germany. And you have these anti-Zionist campaigns in 1950s where Jews were attacked, accused of cosmopolitanism and of Zionism and too friendly to Israel. And that dragged on for decades in East Germany. And in West Germany was also popular in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, until today, that people have these ideas that that Israel is the worst country in the world, and that they blame a lot of things on Israel. And tying into that, what I discussed earlier, saying there is this wish to say, and that's a specific case for Germany, there's this wish saying, well, okay, we Germans were bad in the past, but now look, the Jews, the Israelis doing the same thing with the Palestinians.
Does Israel today give these groups in German society the excuse, and is it, over the years, the decades, there was obviously a lot of resistance given Germany's history and the Holocaust to expressing any kind of some anti-Semitic views, and which does obviously still exist to this day, but now with the state of Israel in existence and thriving for that matter, does it give them that sort of excuse to finally get it off their chest and to use that as their reason to express these views, which otherwise maybe have been latent all these years? Is that perhaps an accurate reflection?
Yes, I would think so. Yes. So you have that, and then these are longer trends, and you can trace that for decades back. And that has evolved. Sometimes there was some good discussions about these kind of things, both questioning some of this narrative from the populist right and also from this anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist left that was really very much influenced by the Soviet propaganda and their anti-Zionist campaigns that people today don't know of often, even if that's almost exactly the same slogans than 40, 50 years back. So you have that. And on top of that, you have now a significant Muslim population also in Germany from countries where anti-Semitism is often kind of a norm or part of the educational system. So even in increasingly, unfortunately, in Turkey, the Turkish government, since Erdogan, is pushing anti-Semitic narratives, maybe not as much as in some other countries like Syria. But now Germany has a sizable Syrian population as well. 700 to 800,000 Syrians live today in Germany. And the educational system is, I mean, they are taught that Hitler was a great man who fought back against the Jews for the Germans. That's in the history books, textbooks in Syrian schools.
In Syrian schools, how is the Holocaust today taught within the broader German educational system, specifically in schools? I'm not referring here to the obviously we know what it's like in the Syrian and some Turkish books for that matter, but within the mainstream German educational system, how is it taught today?
Yeah, it's the education policy is a state policy. So we have 17 states in Germany, and they all have a little bit of different policies on that. And then every school and every teacher does it differently. I would say that in most schools today, the students learn something about the Holocaust. It's not as if maybe when I went to school, well, we started out with the Weimar Republic, and the program in the year was, okay, from Weimar Republic to the end of the Second World War, but we stopped somehow in 1993, and then next year we started after World War II. So it was skipped, and that was the case of in many schools, not all of them. So some had good teachers who really talked about. So it's I think we cannot generalize that, but in most schools, I think they teach something about the Holocaust. The question is rather how it is done, what else is taught about Jewish life in Germany. Jews in Germany have a very long history.
I wanted to ask you about that because it's certainly we're talking about Jewish life in Europe as well, and it's so often it is certainly when looking at through the historical lens, it is tied to, in fact, the matter to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, and to the catastrophes that befell the Jewish people. But there is so much more, obviously, in terms of Jewish culture and history, a richness in so many different elements, including, of course, in Germany and Austria as well. Are those elements discussed, in Germany, for example, when they teach Jewish life, Jewish history? Is it confined mostly to Germany's role in the Holocaust, or do they talk about other elements of Jewish life, Jewish culture, the artists, the philosophers, the science, all these other contributions? Is that part of the discussion?
Unfortunately, not enough. So there are some initiatives, there are some good programs. Even the Jewish Museum in Berlin, they have a good exhibition on that. And there are some, now it's celebrated 1700 years of Jews in Germany, because we have a document from Cologne, or the Roman emperor sent a letter to Cologne that makes clear that at the time, 300 something, there were Jews in Cologne, and they could take part in the town meetings or something. So we have some documents. It's very old history. So there are some initiatives who try to make this point, but I think it's not taught enough. So what many students then take out of school of that is they only see Jews as victims in the Holocaust and nothing else. And most Germans have never interacted with any Jewish person. So that's what often
still to this day.
Yes.
How do you explain that?
Well, there are about 100 to 200,000 Jews in Germany today, out of a population of more than 80 million. So it's unlikely that you meet a Jewish person. And so that is, so you come only in contact with something Jewish in the history lessons of about the Holocaust. So that is also, I think, in a way problematic. Or then maybe on topic of Israel, that is also part of the curriculum of many schools. But often in that, and there have been studies about this, the image of Israel in German textbooks is usually negative. So that's also a problem that people have pointed out repeatedly. And there were a number of commissions that they always have promised to revise the textbooks but that has never actually materialized. So there's a lot of things to be done.
Speaking of a lot of things to be done, I'd love to ask you if you have the ability to get these things done. What would you like to see done in order to change this narrative, change this discussion? I think it was only maybe 2 years ago, Felix Klein, the German Commissioner for Antisemitism, warned Jews in some parts of Berlin, for example, not to wear the kippah, the head covering. What would, we've spoken about educational perspective. Obviously, there's the IRA tool as well. And I'd love to perhaps end on this and perhaps end on a more positive note, if in as much as possible. What other steps perhaps would you like to see done or that could be done in order to change this discussion, in order to ensure that Jews are thriving and that the way sort of this is all being perceived is perhaps changed in a more positive manner? And of course, anti-Semitism can be tackled in the most efficient or effective manner. So in your perhaps view, if you had the power to instruct or to advise, what would you say? What would you do?
Yeah, I mean, there are very good developments. And it's not all, I absolutely wouldn't say that this is a hopeless, it's rather, in general, it's not, many of the things are already going in a good direction. So we have actually now more and more politicians as well and intellectuals who see, well, anti-Semitism is a problem also for themselves, not only for the Jewish people. And I think that is very true because it destroys the societies from within if you have this anti-Semitic thinking with all these conspiracy theories that come with it, and also not taking responsibility. So that is something that I think is necessary. More and more people taking responsibilities, what personal responsibility, also what happened in their own families, right? Not saying, oh, my grandfather, he was a very nice guy, he could never have done anything bad, and he had probably saved so many Jews, when in fact it's very unlikely that he did. Right? So looking into, okay, what happened, responsibilities also in companies or institutions who, after the Third Reich, just moved on, the same companies, maybe with the profit they made during the Second World War with the slave laborers they exploited. Right? So what happened is there are some initiatives, more and more. There are these commissions that look into these things, but this would need some more reflection on it. And of course, combating anti-Semitism seriously, not only on the surface. So if you have, if people don't understand that anti-Semitism is also bad for the society, you end up with some statements like, you might recall this. Well, obviously you recall the attack against the synagogue in Halle on Yom Kippur 2018. And then sometime afterwards, Sigmar Gabriel, he was a longtime leader of the Social Democrat Party. He was a foreign minister. He was vice chancellor. And then he gave an interview with Der Spiegel. And he said in this interview about this incident in Halle, he said, I have the quote here, "I'm not at all sure that Germans actually know how lucky in misfortune we have been. If the perpetrator had broken down the door as he had intended to do and perpetrated a massacre among Jews in the synagogue in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, and then the interviewer jumps in, would we have a different republic, Mr. Gabriel?" He responds, "I'm always careful with such terms, but in any case, the international view of Germany would be different." That means, first of all, Jews are not included in his we Germans. So still, I mean, that's what German Jews who were attacked in Halle. And secondly, he's more concerned with the view of Germany when it comes to even these violent forms of anti-Semitism. So we have to come to a perspective, and he's not an anti-Semite. He is in favor of protecting Jewish communities, and he wants that money's been spent on this kind of protection. But we have to come to a view that people see that as also their own problem, and not only as an image problem. So, and we have more and more people who realize that, but still not enough, and still a lot of rejection against any kind of concretely pointing out to some specific incidents, not just in general term. Everyone in general is against anti-Semitism, especially in Germany, right? But if you become specific, saying, well, look, maybe this could be, let's discuss it. And that's why I think the IRA definition is important. Let's discuss it. So maybe this is anti-Semitic. Let's discuss it. Let's take it seriously. And then maybe not. And maybe we can overcome it. But if we just say, per definition, it cannot be, as one of these latest attempts to have an alternative definition tries to do it, this and this, if you attack Israel, this cannot be anti-Semitic, or almost in this strong terms saying it. Well, this is counterproductive. And this is, in fact, shutting down productive discussions about what could be anti-Semitic and how to overcome it.
Günther, I wanted to truly thank you, not just from a personal perspective, but on behalf of the International Legal Forum for speaking tonight. I know we went far over time, but I think that really goes to the to the importance of the discussion, not just about the anti-Semitism in general, about the importance of adopting the IRA definition, but also about the situation in Germany, as you've expressed. So you've offered a lot of, I think this is what's been particularly helpful, not just some sobering analysis about what is happening, but more importantly, about what can be done and how, the tools at our disposal and how they can be used in order to combat this hatred in all its manifestations. So once again, I wanted to say thank you so much for your time, for all your research, and really for your leadership on this issue. It's truly been a delight to have you on this episode of How We Fought Against the podcast from the ILF. So Günther, I want to say thank you once again. Appreciate that.
Thank you on the Legal Forum as well. You're doing great work.
Pleasure. We can only do so with great people and partners like yourself as well. To everyone else watching us, please, you can follow us on Facebook under the International Legal Forum. This podcast will be available on all our social media platforms. That includes YouTube, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Podbean. I hope I haven't missed anything out as well. You can also, of course, go directly to our website at ilfngo.org. Once again, thank you so much, Günther, for being with us, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you, and good evening from us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.